Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. In a previous episode, I talked about our limitations in our understanding of satire, which I think are really rooted in this need to give rhetorical interpretations of text primacy over aesthetic interpretations of text. So, if something is absurd, we have this tendency to interpret it as being satirical and having a rhetorical function, even when it may just be purely absurd, and that might be the aesthetic value of it. And I think that has a lot of relationship with our limited understanding of metaphor. I've talked about this before every once in a while, but it is an issue that I like to come back to. But we tend to have a very Western sort of understanding of the juxtaposition of images where if two things are juxtaposed against each other, one must stand in for the other, and the one that tends to have we tend to favor is the one that's outside of the text, the non-aesthetic one, the rhetorical one, the cerebral one tends to be the one that we favor. We favor the real world over the fictional world. We favor the rhetorical over the purely aesthetic. But as an artist, it's counterproductive to do that, arguably. And you can certainly look at that in terms of metaphor. My favorite example of this always is the X-Men, which is one of my favorite comics of all time. And it's one where it lends itself very easily to a metaphorical interpretation. And Stan Lee was pretty overt about his interest in the metaphorical interpretation. So I do want to point out that my criticism of our understanding of metaphor is not to say, it's not an either-or sort of situation. It's not to say it can never be metaphorical. But as an artist, I would prioritize the aesthetic over the rhetorical. So in X-Men, for example, if we think about it as metaphorical of any sort of prejudice, where the mutants are victims of various forms of prejudice and violent actions against them, and certainly prejudice groups murdering them in masses and stuff like that. We could certainly see the metaphorical interpretation of other forms of prejudice in the real world. So our common sort of interpretation of that sort of metaphor is to say the more important thing is that it teaches us about prejudice. But if you think through that, I mean, that's a post-rationalization, arguably. If you think through that, it's problematic in many ways because ultimately it is a bad metaphor. So I love the X-Men. Some of my favorite comic book stories of all time are X-Men stories. But if the value of the X-Men was the metaphor, it would be a very bad story because it is a very bad metaphor. Because if you think of any kind of prejudice that might stand in for, it fails because mutants can be genuinely dangerous. If you think about, like, Rogue is really my favorite X-Men character. I think she's has had some magnificent stories. She's really compelling. She has this fascinating trajectory of going from pure bitterness to heroism. She's a fantastic example of this ultimately vulnerable character who's also invulnerable at the same time. She, has this emotional vulnerability that manifests as outward toughness that creates lots of complicated layering in the character. So magnificent character. But she was born a mutant, and her mutant power kills people. It can kill people. It very overtly is a harmful mutant power. So if the value of that character is the metaphorical value of the character, you're essentially saying that this thing that people are born with that is a source of prejudice is legitimately dangerous, and that Rogue has a responsibility to learn how to use this dangerous thing that she's born with in order not to hurt other people. it makes X-Men more complicated, arguably, because you have characters like Magneto who argue that because mutants are born with these powers that makes them superior, on some technical levels, sure, Professor X can read minds. I mean, in a way, Magneto has a point there. Magneto can bend metal. In a way, he has a point there. Um, so it's they're superior. They do have technically superior powers to people just born without any sort of power. I mean, so the metaphor just really falls apart completely. So if the value is that mutants function as this metaphor for any other sort of prejudice, it completely falls apart. And it is a bad story. And I would say it's not a bad story, even if you look at Rogue, if you look at Magneto and Professor X. What really makes those great stories? Well, they're really, deeply complicated emotional stories. And that's what really makes an X-Men story really valuable. Is the emotional complexity of it. That's if you applied the Mogon system to that, and you said, if you read an X-Men story, you might say it's valuable because the metaphor for prejudice is really potent, of course. I mean, it definitely is. Inarguably, I'm not saying that's an irrelevant factor. It's not an either-or type of situation. That is a factor. But you would also say, my emotional attachment to all of these different characters is what is really enjoyable about that. So if you take those two factors, if you said the metaphor for prejudice is really potent, emotionally potent, and rhetorically potent, and if you said my emotional attachment to the characters is why I really enjoy the story. If you take that and you say, can I technically make that a universal and apply it to pretty much any other story? Could you apply that to Spider-Man? I was just watching Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Could you apply that to Superman? Could you apply that to any other story? And the metaphor part doesn't really work, but still the emotional connection to the characters works. I mean, it's emotionally complex sort of story with Spider-Man. Is as resonant for many, many reasons as the X-Men stories are. So that makes a more effective universal sort of standard for understanding what is legitimately appealing about the stories. And you can look at like the metaphor for adolescence. That's sort of what Stan Lee was sort of, intentionally, he was integrating images that would resonate really potently with adolescent audiences because the mutant powers manifest in adolescence. That's another way where both of those aspects of the story, the two different metaphors, in some ways there's a bit of crossover, in other ways there's not any kind of crossover at all. It's like any other form of prejudice. It doesn't develop necessarily in adolescence. It's something that you have from birth. But mutancy certainly works as this really potent image of adolescence. And you can call it a metaphor, certainly, for adolescence. But what is the rhetorical value of that? I mean, what is he arguing? Certainly with the prejudice metaphor, the argument is bigotry, and Stanley used to always say bigotry, which is a weird sort of pronunciation. The argument is, the rhetorical interpretation is that bigotry is bad, and Stanley would point that out all the time. And that is a potent sort of thing that you could certainly take from the X-Men. But what is the argument with adolescence? That you shouldn't judge adolescents for going through a change? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of an iffy sort of rhetorical interpretation there. But in both of those cases, with the adolescence metaphor, quote-unquote metaphor, and the prejudice metaphor, in both of those cases, if you drill deep into the emotional response of changes in adolescence, you're going through these physical changes, you feel isolated, you feel, freakish, you feel like nobody understands you. All of that stuff works really effectively. Similarly with prejudice, what are the emotional resonances of being the victim of prejudice? And the mutants, whether or not the actual real life metaphor works at all, there is a significant, tremendous emotional resonance of being the victim of prejudice that is consistent whether or not you interpret it as a metaphor for adolescence or a metaphor for prejudice. those two become consistent once you really look at it as a manifestation of the emotional resonances of being an adolescent and being the victim of prejudice. Then you have much more effective sort of a crossover, and one that's much more practical for an artist to adapt, to drill into what a feeling is and have something that really manifests out of that. And I think that's a place where I disagree with the common interpretation of dreams as metaphors. I don't think dreams are metaphors. This is another misunderstanding of metaphors. If you have an image in a dream, it's a manifestation of this deep, deep feeling that you have, that in order to really process it subconsciously, in order to process this really complicated feeling subconsciously, it boils into your perceptions and your mental perceptions as images. So, going to school and finding out you have a test you didn't prepare for, that's a manifestation of anxiety. That's not really a metaphor for anxiety. What sort of rhetorical implications does it have? Does it have any necessary relationship with anything outside of your mental processes? Well, no, it's just a manifestation of your anxiety. So what sort of manifestation of anxiety is about adolescence? How would that manifest as these freakish changes that occur in adolescence? A perfect sort of image for a manifestation of these deep anxieties about adolescence. So I think that understanding that sort of image that way is much more consistent and much more practical for the artist, and I would argue more accurate, but it's not an either or exclusion of metaphors. So I'm doing a deep dive into Toni Morrison lately, and I heard about this interview that she had where when she was starting out writing, people would tell her that political writing was not aesthetic. And I think that's a problematic way of really thinking about it as this really either or. I would never say that political writing is not aesthetic. It's just one of the choices. What I've heard more often is that art has to be political, which I would totally reject. But I would never read a political piece and say that can't be art because it's political. I mean, one of my favorite poets is Allen Ginsberg, and certainly you can interpret. This is negotiable, and I would disagree with some of the interpretations, but certainly it's valid to interpret his work. That's getting into the complicated weeds of interpretation, of course, but it's totally valid to interpret his work as political, but is it also emotionally complex and deeply resonant? And are some of his really intense images, while being able to be interpreted as political metaphors, do they work on that deep, complex emotional level? Well, of course. So it's not an either or, that's the important thing to remember. Never tell an artist that politics are not aesthetic and therefore you can't ever write political pieces. That's ridiculous. But on the same level, it would be entirely inaccurate to say all art has to be political. There's a whole other very complicated argument. I think I've made videos about that argument before. That's an argument in bad faith, to say it all has to be political. So either one of those either ors is ineffective, but I would say the practical thing would be to drill down into the feeling itself. How does that feeling manifest as a visual image or an auditory image or any kind of image? So this ties with the Opal Bean project. All these videos lately that I'm doing tie in with the Opal Bean War project, because I have a story called The Ungulates, and it's based on a prompt. Somebody gave me the prompt of diversity. I think it was, I can't remember. It was 3 different terms: diversity, inclusion, and, well, diversity is one of them. So how do you make a really emotionally resonant story about diversity and inclusion? So I drilled down into that feeling, and it's sort of, a lot of the Opal Bean War project stuff is linked together. So the way the image manifested is really directly linked with another story, where I had a character who was teaching Shakespeare, and she collected little figurines of ungulates that showed up in Shakespeare, which is a reference to another story about all the birds that show up in Shakespeare. But anyway, all of these stories are connected. But so I took that idea with another concept from another story, which is that there was this, sort of magical way to bring inanimate objects to life. It's called the Candlenut. There's a whole other story about that. So the idea is that the students in this Shakespeare class bring these ungulate figurines to life, and they have full consciousness. And the whole idea of full consciousness very much influenced by the Oz books. One of my favorite characters of all time is Jack Pumpkinhead from the second Oz book. Jack Pumpkinhead comes into full consciousness as a conscious, free-thinking, human-type creature. And you can look at the Scarecrow, and there's a lot of other characters like that, or the Gump in book 2. They're magically brought to life, and they have full consciousness. So what happens when you have this school where you have these creatures who were newly made conscious, all of these ungulate figurines, who these students, these high school students, decided to give consciousness to these little ungulates. And they have full consciousness, they have full lives, they have fully fleshed out choices. I haven't gotten this far in the story, so we'll see what actually happens in the story. This is the idea. What happens when you have all of these creatures, and presumably, just based on my influence from Ionesco, my hero, it will keep accumulating. So there will be more and more living creatures who are going to the school, who have to figure out who they are, what their rights are. They want an education too. They want to make these choices too. So in one way, it is a metaphor for diversity. But if you push the rhetoric of that too far, it falls apart. And I have no real intention of making an argument about diversity. What I'm trying to do is set up a situation where you have characters who are uncertain about diversity and inclusion, and they have to. The setup is dramatic. The actual argument is not something that is controlling the progression of the story. Just the setup is there for living creatures, the ungulates in that case, living human characters, to figure out in and of themselves how to really negotiate all of these different complexities. And I have no agenda. I have no direction that I wanted to go. I'm just going to listen to what they say and see where it takes me. This is also something that comes up in Harry Potter book 4. I've been tying some stuff into the Harry Potter books that my son and I have been listening to. And in book 4, there's a whole subplot about the house elves. And I think that's one of the things J.K. Rowling sort of brought into the stories that she didn't quite make work, because, yes, legitimately, the house elves are abused workers. But then everybody defends the current system of the house elves, and they look horrible doing it. Like, Hagrid defends the current abuses of the house elves, and that really makes them look bad. So it's sort of like in book 2 when she integrated the whole Nazi metaphor. And my only problem with that is bringing in a really, really serious, intensely complicated sort of argument in a book where they're still just 12. I think one of the things that works really, really well for the Harry Potter series is that the narrative itself matures as the characters mature. But in book 2, you bring in this super mature storyline. And in book 4, you have Hermione who's has this effort to liberate these oppressed peoples, but it's really just a subplot, and it's really only Hermione who looks good in that. And again, I mean, if you press the metaphor to its rhetorical end, it really falls apart as a metaphor. So I think book 4 is a great book. So for so many, many reasons, it's one of my favorites for so many, many reasons. But I think one of the things that just doesn't quite work is the house elf thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite fit in, and it kind of makes everyone look bad, except for Hermione. I mean, it's sort of painted as Hermione being kind of ridiculous, but if you think about the implications of it, she's being very reasonable, but there's really no way out of it. It's sort of like J.K. Rowling set up this plot that she didn't really have a good resolution that she could possibly do with it. I mean, so that's something to learn from, just as I pursue. I mean, the whole plot of the Undulate story is kind of the house elves plot. It's not a side plot. I mean, I think that's one of the problems with the house elf plot is it's a subplot. It is the plot. So I don't know how I'm going to get out of it. I can recognize the struggles that J.K. Rowling had to get out of that plot with everyone intact. I don't think she quite made it work. I mean, it's an amazing book, but she didn't quite make that part work. So I'll try to figure out, to try to avoid the pitfalls of the house elf subplot. But anyway, that's about all I had to say about metaphors. It's one of my favorite things to complain about, so I'll probably come back around to it. I'll see you on the next episode.